Chapter 1. The Girl Who Was Never Chosen. There was a particular kind of silence that lived in the Thornvale dining hall, and Alara had learned every shape of it the way other people learn the shape of their own name. It was not the silence of peace, the comfortable quiet of a room where nothing needed to be said. It was the silence that came after her father asked a question and did not wait for her answer. It was the silence that followed when her opinion on the harvest treaties, or the border patrols, or the color of the banners for the summer festival was met with a nod toward her sister instead, as though Alara's voice were a sound the room had simply learned to filter out, the way one stops hearing the wind against old shutters after enough winters. Ivy would answer. Ivy always answered, golden-haired and quick-tongued, raised since infancy to be the daughter a king could parade before his court with pride, while Alara sat 2 seats down the long table, present in body and absent in every way that mattered, a shape at the edge of a painting no one had bothered to finish. Tonight was no different. King Alaric, known to his people as King Dorian, a name Alara had heard used her whole life and never once heard explained, and had long since learned better than to ask about, set down his goblet and looked past her entirely, the way a man looks past a servant refilling his wine. "Ivy," he said, "what do you make of the Wolfmere delegation's arrival tomorrow?" "An opportunity, father." Ivy's voice was smooth, rehearsed, the cadence of someone who had practiced this answer in front of a mirror. "Wolfmere commands the largest standing pack among the 5 kingdoms. If we can secure their goodwill through the marriage alliance, Thornvale's borders will finally rest easy for a generation."
"Good."
The king nodded, satisfied, already reaching for his wine, as though the matter were settled and required no further thought from anyone at that table. Alara stared at the untouched food on her plate. She had an opinion, too. She had spent 2 quiet years reading every treaty Thornvale had ever signed with the Wolf Kingdoms because, unlike her sister, she had nothing else to occupy the long, unwatched hours of her days except learning things nobody had ever asked her to learn. She knew, for instance, that Wolfmere's laws around forced marriage carried older, stranger clauses than most modern courts remembered to fear. She knew that the ancient right of conquest still technically overrode any prearranged betrothal, though no one had invoked it in 3 generations. She said none of it. Saying things had never once changed the shape of this particular silence, and she had stopped expecting it to. Beside her, Corwin found her hand beneath the table, a small and familiar comfort worn smooth from repetition, like a coin rubbed featureless by too many hands. In 3 months, she would marry him, not because either of them particularly wanted it, but because it was convenient and safe and utterly without consequence to anyone but herself. She would live in the same halls she had always lived in, unseen in the same familiar ways, only now with a husband who loved her the way one loves a well-worn coat, warm enough, useful enough, never once mistaken for anything precious. She used to imagine another kind of life, back when she was young enough to still believe imagining changed anything. She had stopped. Wanting things that would never come to pass only sharpened the particular ache of watching them not arrive, and Alara had decided, somewhere around her 16th winter, that she would rather feel nothing at all than feel that ache on purpose, night after night, for the rest of her life. She did not know, climbing the cold stone stairs to her chambers that night, candle guttering in the draught, that within 2 days every quiet expectation she had built her life around would be dismantled in front of the entire court. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. I always love seeing which city or country you're watching from. The delegation from Wolfmere arrived at midday beneath banners the color of wet slate, a column of riders moving through the gates with the unhurried confidence of wolves who had never once needed to hurry for anyone. At their head rode a young man introduced by the herald as Prince Rhys, golden-eyed, easy-smiled, dressed in a way that made it clear he expected and had always received admiration. Beside him rode someone else entirely, and it was this second man Alara's eyes found first, though she could not have said why. He did not look at the assembled crowd the way Reese did, cataloging faces for approval. He looked at it the way a soldier studies unfamiliar terrain, measuring distances, marking the guards, noting where the shadows fell longest. He wore plainer clothes than the men riding beside him, and yet every guard in the courtyard straightened as he passed, and every hushed conversation among the Thornvale nobility died the instant his gaze crossed it, as though his silence carried more authority than anyone else's voice. She learned his name an hour later, once the formalities began in the great hall. Kale, a warrior of no announced royal title, standing half a step behind Reese with the stillness of a drawn blade sheathed and waiting. Everyone in that hall had assumed they knew what would happen next. It had been assumed for the better part of a year, ever since talk of this alliance first began circulating through the court. Ivy had been groomed for it, trained in Wolfmere customs, taught the particular formal bow the Wolf Kingdoms expected of a bride, coached in every phrase of greeting that might please a foreign prince. Alara watched her sister's chin lift in quiet anticipation as Kale stepped forward, cleared his throat once, and began to speak of an old, uncommon law. By ancient right, he said, and his voice did not rise, did not need to, carrying easily to every corner of the silent hall. Any warrior who has personally slain 7 Ferox holds the authority to name the terms of a peace marriage between our houses, a right older than any crown currently seated in the 5 kingdoms. A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles. Alara saw her father's jaw tighten, saw him glance toward his advisors as though searching for a way to interrupt what he already sensed was coming. By that right, Kale continued, Wolfmere names its bride. He did not look at Ivy. He looked directly at Alara, across the width of the hall, and held her gaze with an intensity that made her feel, absurdly, as though every other person in the room had simply ceased to exist. Alara Thornvale, he said, will marry the crown of Wolfmere. The silence that followed was unlike any Alara had ever known in that hall. Not the silence of being overlooked, but the violent, collective silence of every eye in the room suddenly, unbearably, finding her at once. She felt her father's hand close hard around the arm of his throne. She saw Ivy's face drain the color of ash, saw her sister's carefully rehearsed composure crack down the middle. She felt something rise in her own chest that was not quite fear, and not quite joy, but some third, nameless thing. Because for the first time in memory, someone had chosen her, deliberately, publicly, in front of the entire court, and her father's permission had nothing whatsoever to do with it. King Alaric could not refuse. The law was older than his crown, and every noble in that hall knew it as well as he did. Alara watched something shift behind her father's eyes as the reality settled in. Not grief at losing a daughter he barely looked at. She understood even in that first dizzy moment, but calculation, cold and quick, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. That night, for the first time in years, he came to her chambers alone. You will go to Wolfmere, he said, without preamble, without so much as a greeting, and before you do anything for your husband, you will do something for your kingdom. She waited, saying nothing, learning long ago that silence was often the only power she had left to wield. Centuries ago, when our 2 houses first bound themselves in an uneasy peace, Thornvale surrendered its royal seal to Wolfmere as a bond of good faith. It has sat in their deepest vault ever since, half forgotten, a relic no one thinks to guard closely because no one thinks to fear it any longer. Without that seal restored to Thornvale, our claim to this throne could be challenged in law by anyone patient enough to dig through old treaty archives. I need it returned. Quietly. You will find your way into that vault, and you will bring it home to me. It was not concern for her that had carried him up those stairs. It never was. But it was, for the first time and longer than she could remember, a purpose larger than being overlooked at supper, and some small, starved part of her seized on it despite everything she knew about the man offering it. I understand, she said. Her father studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she meant it, and then turned and left without another word, without touching her, without a single wish for her safety or happiness in the marriage that had just upended her entire life. Alara sat alone in the dark long after his footsteps faded, turning the shape of everything over in her mind like an unfamiliar coin she could not decide whether to spend. The morning of her departure, Alara stood alone in the gallery where her mother's single portrait hung, something she had done perhaps a dozen times in her life, without ever once being told why the woman in the painting looked at her the way she did, soft, searching, as though trying to memorize a face she would never see grown. No one had ever told Alara her mother's name. Her father forbade the subject entirely, and the servants who might have remembered had long since been replaced or had learned, wisely, to hold their tongues. She touched the frame once, the way she always did before any significant change in her life, a small private ritual that meant nothing to anyone but herself, and left Thornvale, without knowing that the woman in that painting would soon become the answer to every question she had never been allowed to ask. Ivy came to her the next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the eastern towers, her face still pale from the shock of the previous night. She did not apologize for the years of careful favoritism, nor did Alara expect her to. That was not the kind of family they had ever been. Instead, Ivy simply sat on the edge of Alara's bed, knees drawn up beneath her nightdress, and said, in a small voice Alara had rarely heard her use, "I don't know whether to be furious with you or grateful. I spent a year learning a language I'll never need to speak. And you get carried off by a man who slew 7 ferox with his own hands." She paused. "Are you frightened?" "Terrified," Alara admitted, because there was no one left to perform composure for any more, not with Ivy, not this early in the morning. "But it's a different kind of fear than I'm used to. I don't know how to explain it." "Try," Ivy said. "At home I was afraid of staying exactly the same forever," Alara said slowly, working the thought out as she spoke it aloud for the first time. "Now I'm afraid of everything changing too fast to hold on to. I'm not sure which fear is worse." Ivy studied her for a long moment, something unreadable behind her eyes, and then reached out and squeezed her hand once, briefly, before rising to leave. It was the closest thing to warmth the two of them had exchanged in years, and Alara turned it over in her mind for days afterward, unsure what to make of it. The preparations for her departure took only 2 days, though it felt, to Alara, as though the whole of her old life were being folded and packed away far too quickly to properly mourn it. Servants moved through her chambers cataloging which gowns would travel with her and which belonged, from now on, to a princess who no longer lived there. Corwin came to see her once, stiff and formal in the doorway, and said only that he wished her well, that the law had decided what neither of them had, and that he hoped Wolfmere would be kinder to her than Thornvale had managed to be. She thanked him, and meant it, and understood that whatever they had shared had never been large enough to survive being tested, and that perhaps that had always been the quiet tragedy of it. The journey itself took 2 days, over roads Alara had never traveled, through country that grew wilder and greener the further they rode from Thornvale's familiar hills. She rode in a carriage with 2 ladies-in-waiting she barely knew, women assigned to her only that week, and spent most of the journey watching the unfamiliar landscape slide past the window, trying to memorize the shape of a life she was leaving behind before it disappeared entirely from reach. She thought, more than once, of turning back, not out of any longing for Thornvale itself, but out of the simple, animal fear of the unknown, the same fear that had kept her quiet and small for so many years. She did not turn back. She had spent her whole life choosing safety over everything else, and it had earned her nothing but a lifetime of being overlooked. Whatever waited at the end of this road, she told herself, could not possibly be worse than disappearing entirely inside a life she had never once chosen for herself. 3 days later, on neutral ground between the 2 kingdoms, Alara stood across from the man who had chosen her in front of an entire court and signed her name beneath his on parchment older than either of their bloodlines. The ceremony was called the blood-bound oath, and it held nothing romantic about it whatsoever. Pricked fingers, old words spoken in a tongue she did not know, a binding that settled into her chest like a hook sinking slowly into still water. If either of them ever killed the other, the spell would claim both their lives in the same breath. It was not a marriage built on love. It was a marriage built on mutual, magically enforced restraint, and Alara found she preferred its honesty to the comfortable lie of her arrangement with Corwin. That night, for the first time, she dreamed of a man with silver eyes. She could not see his face clearly. It kept sliding away from her like reflections on disturbed water, but she remembered the eyes with a clarity that unsettled her upon waking, and a low, steady voice that said nothing she could recall except her own name, spoken as though it meant something worth saying carefully. She told no one. She did not understand it herself, and there was no one yet in this cold, unfamiliar place she trusted enough to ask. Chapter 2. The Wolf with Silver Eyes. Dusk Haven was carved into the belly of a mountain the way Thornvale was built upon an open hill, and the difference showed in everything. The low gray stone, torches burning even at midday in halls the sun could not fully reach, the way every wolf in that court moved through their own home like something coiled and half a breath from shifting shape entirely. Alara arrived a stranger inside her own marriage. Rhys, the prince she believed she had married, treated her with a courteous distance that felt oddly rehearsed, as though he were reciting lines from a play he had long since tired of performing but could not yet abandon. Their meals together were stilted affairs, polite questions about her journey, careful compliments about the Dusk Haven cuisine, nothing that ever ventured near anything real. She found herself, more than once, watching him mid-sentence and catching some flicker of exhaustion behind his easy smile, as though the performance of being someone he was not cost him more than he let anyone see. "You're very good at this," she told him once, after a particularly hollow exchange about the weather over the eastern passes. "Whatever this is." "Practice," he said, and something in the single word carried more weariness than she expected. "You get very good at anything, given enough years of practicing it alone." She did not understand then what he meant. She would, before long. It was Cale, dismissed by the court as merely the warrior who had claimed her, a hero of no particular royal weight, who unsettled her most, though she could not have explained why even to herself. He watched her the way he had watched the Thornvale courtyard on the day they first met, cataloging exits, measuring threats, never quite at ease. She resented him for it, in the small, useless way one resents a stranger for making them feel exposed. It was Cale, not Rhys, who was assigned to train her. A wife of Wolfmere who cannot defend herself becomes a hostage the moment anyone learns it, he told her plainly, the first gray morning, in a stone yard ringed by old, battered sparring dummies. "I don't particularly care whether you welcome this arrangement. You will learn regardless of your feelings on the matter." "How generous of you," she said, "to be taught by a man who apparently cannot be bothered to smile." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but near enough to needle her further than she expected it to. The training was brutal in ways nothing in her sheltered life had prepared her for. He did not go easy on her simply because she was a princess, and for the first weeks she hit the packed dirt of that yard more times than she could count. Wooden blade knocked from her grip, legs swept clean from under her, breath driven from her lungs, until her entire body ached with a soreness that felt, strangely, like the first honest thing anyone had given her in years. Nobody in Thornvale had ever demanded she become strong. They had only ever demanded she remain quiet, decorative, unobtrusive. Cale demanded the opposite of her, every single morning, without apology. "Again," he said, extending a hand to pull her from the dirt for what felt like the 100th time that week. "You enjoy this," she accused, breathless, taking the offered hand despite every instinct telling her not to. I enjoy watching people discover what they're actually capable of, he said, hauling her upright with an ease that reminded her uncomfortably of exactly how much strength he kept carefully leashed around her. Most people never bother to find out. It's easier to stay small. The weeks that followed built on each other in small, hard-won increments. He taught her first to fall properly, insisting that knowing how to hit the ground without breaking something mattered more in the beginning than knowing how to strike. Then came footwork, hours of it, drilled until her legs shook with exhaustion and her mind, mercifully, went quiet for the first time in years, empty of everything except the next step, the next shift of weight. Only once she could move without thinking did he introduce the blade in earnest, and even then, he kept the lesson simple. How to create distance, how to use an opponent's eyes against them, how to recognize the half-second before a strike where an opening always briefly appeared. You think too much before you move, he told her, more than once. Your body already knows what to do. Stop asking it permission. That's rather easier to say when you've had a lifetime of practice. It is, he agreed. Which is why I'm not asking you to match me. I'm asking you to trust yourself the way I've learned to trust you, one step at a time. She hated, in those early weeks, how much that single sentence meant to her, how starved she had been, without ever quite admitting it to herself, for someone who believed she was capable of more than quiet obedience. By the fourth week, she was landing strikes he did not bother to fully block, small victories that felt, each time, larger than they should have. By the sixth week, the guards who had once watched her training with poorly concealed amusement had stopped watching with anything but genuine respect. There were setbacks, too. Days when her body simply refused to cooperate, when frustration got the better of her discipline, and she threw her practice blade across the yard in a fit of temper that left Cale watching her with something between amusement and understanding. Good, he said on one such afternoon, retrieving the blade and pressing it back into her hand. Now you know what your anger feels like when it has somewhere useful to go. Most people never learn that. They just let it rot somewhere quiet instead. Is that what happened to you? She asked, surprised by her own boldness. Once, he admitted. A long time ago, before I learned better. It cost me more than I was willing to pay twice. He did not elaborate, and she did not press him, understanding by then that some doors opened only when a person was ready to walk through them on their own terms, not when someone else forced the hinge. She had no retort for that. She simply stood in the packed dirt, catching her breath, and let herself notice, for the first time without immediately looking away, the strange, shifting color of his eyes. Gold in torchlight, gray in shade, and once, startlingly, in a shaft of dying afternoon sun slanting through the yard's high windows, unmistakably silver. Her stomach dropped, cold and sudden. She told herself, walking back to her chambers that evening, that a color was only a color, that eyes shifted shade in strange light more often than anyone bothered to notice, that she was building a mystery out of nothing more than coincidence and the loneliness of a new, unfamiliar life. It was easier in the daylight to believe that. She said nothing. She told herself it meant nothing. But that night the dream returned again, sharper this time. The silver-eyed stranger's voice closer than before, and she woke with her heart hammering against her ribs and a suspicion she refused to name even in the privacy of her own thoughts. The weeks blurred into an unfamiliar rhythm, training by day until her muscles burned, forced pleasantries with Reese over meals she barely tasted, and at night, the quiet work her father had set her to complete. She learned the vault sat beneath the western wing, lightly guarded because no one living remembered to fear an old treaty seal gathering dust in the dark. She memorized the guard rotations, the patterns of torchlight and shadow, the hours when the western corridor emptied. She told herself this was simply duty, the last obedient act she owed a father who had never once looked at her the way Cale looked at her sparring stance, as though it were worth correcting precisely, because it was worth improving. The night she finally slipped past the western guards and into the private wing housing the old vault, She took a wrong turn in the unfamiliar dark and found herself, instead, standing in a chamber she did not recognize, Kale's private study, she would later understand, sparse and unadorned except for one object that stopped her cold in the doorway. A portrait, half-finished, propped carelessly against the far wall as though someone had abandoned it mid-stroke. A man with silver eyes. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the face from her dreams, rendered in careful paint, unmistakable, even unfinished, even without the lower half of the jaw yet given shape. She took one step closer, reaching toward the canvas as though her fingers alone could confirm what her eyes refused to fully believe, and the door behind her opened without warning. Alara. She spun. Reese stood in the doorway, his easy, practiced smile gone entirely, replaced by something sharp and wary she had never once seen cross his face before. "I got lost," she said, far too quickly, her voice betraying the lie even to her own ears. His eyes moved past her shoulder to the portrait, and something crossed his expression, not quite anger, but the look of a man watching a carefully constructed wall begin, very quietly, to crack down its center. "You should return to your rooms," he said. "Now, Alara. Please." She went, heart pounding painfully against her ribs. The silver-eyed face burned permanently into her memory, understanding with a cold, creeping certainty that something in this marriage was not remotely what it appeared to be on its surface, and having no idea yet how close that quiet instinct had already brought her to the truth of it. She did not sleep again that night. She lay awake tracing the shape of the portrait in her mind, comparing it against every face she had seen since arriving in Duskhaven, the guards, the stewards, the visiting lords, and finding it matched none of them cleanly, until, inevitably, her thoughts circled back to Kale. She dismissed the thought each time it surfaced. It felt impossible. Kale was a warrior with no title, tolerated by the court, rather than deferred to, while the man in the portrait had been painted with the particular reverence reserved for someone people knelt before. And yet the eyes would not leave her. The next morning, training resumed as though nothing had happened, though Alara found herself watching Kale with a new, wary attentiveness she could not fully suppress. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything, cataloging her the same way he cataloged doorways and exits. "You're distracted," he said, blocking a strike she had not fully committed to. "That will get you hurt faster than any lack of skill." "I'm allowed to think of more than one thing at once," she said, recovering her stance. "Even you can't drill that out of me." "I'm not trying to drill it out of you," he said. "I'm trying to teach you when thinking helps and when it only slows your hand. There's a difference, and it matters more than you'd like to believe right now." "I found a portrait last night," she said, watching his face carefully as she said it. "In a room I wasn't meant to be in." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone almost before she could name it. "Then you should be more careful where you wander," he said, and pressed the training forward without another word on the subject, though she noticed, for the rest of that session, that his usual ease had gone brittle at the edges. That evening Reese sought her out in the corridor outside her chambers, his expression carefully arranged into something apologetic. "I'm sorry if I frightened you last night," he said. "It wasn't my intention. There are things in this court that are not yet safe for you to know, and I would rather you hear them properly, in time, than stumble into them in the dark." "Then tell me now," she said. "I am tired of stumbling." He hesitated, visibly torn, and for a moment she thought he might actually tell her everything right there in the corridor. Instead, he only said quietly, "Soon. I promise you soon," and left her standing there with more questions than she had carried before. The shape of the silver-eyed man's face still burned behind her eyes every time she closed them. Chapter 3. The Fire That Should Have Died. The truth arrived to her in pieces, the way truths in Wolfmere seemed to arrive, sideways, through servants' half-whispered conversations and sentences left deliberately unfinished, rather than anything spoken to her directly. The first piece came from an old healer tending a minor burn on Alara's palm from a training accident, who let slip, almost absently, a story about the Crown Prince's childhood, a story about twin boys, one born strong and one born failing, and a bargain struck long ago with something far older than any king who had ever sat a throne in the 5 kingdoms. The healer caught herself mid-sentence and refused to say anything further, no matter how gently Alara pressed, but the shape of it lodged in her mind like a splinter working its way slowly toward the surface. She uncovered the rest of it not through cleverness, but through Kale himself. On a night, she came upon him alone in the training yard long after the torches had been banked low for sleep, his shirt discarded on a nearby bench, dark veins visible beneath the skin of his chest, threading upward from somewhere near his heart like cracks spreading slowly through glass left out in frost. He did not hear her approach at first. She watched, frozen in the shadow of the doorway, as a gray cloak, one of the robed, silent order she had noticed moving through the castle like living ghosts, pressed both palms flat against Kale's chest and drew something visible out of him, something that glowed a faint, sickly orange beneath the moonlight before it dimmed and vanished entirely into the priest's cupped hands. Kale's whole body sagged with what looked like equal parts relief and exhaustion, his breath coming ragged in the cold night air. "You shouldn't be here," he said, without turning around, once the gray cloak had departed as silently as it had come. "What was that?" she asked, unable to stop the question from leaving her. He was quiet for a long, considering moment, long enough that Alara half expected him to send her away the way he had sent her away from every other private corner of himself since her arrival. Instead, he sat down heavily on the low stone bench at the yard's edge, and after a moment, without quite deciding to, she sat beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him even in the cold night air. Perhaps because he had grown tired of carrying the weight of it entirely alone, or perhaps because some part of him had already, quietly, decided she deserved the truth of it, he told her. When he and his twin brother Ronan were children, Ronan had fallen deathly ill with something no healer in Wolfmere could touch or name. Kale, not yet old enough to fully understand the price of what he offered, had gone alone to an ancient being known only as the Silent One and pledged half of his own remaining lifespan in exchange for his brother's continued life. Ronan had lived, but the bargain had settled permanently into Kale's body as a curse the gray cloaks called the Fading Flame, a fire that made him faster, stronger, harder to kill than any wolf alive in the 5 kingdoms, and that was, slowly and irreversibly, burning him down to nothing at all. "How long?" Alara asked quietly, sitting down beside him in the cold dirt without quite deciding to, "before it finally takes you?" He looked at her sideways, as though surprised she had not flinched away from him entirely, as though he had expected fear rather than the plain, steady question she had actually asked. "You're not afraid of me," he said. It was not quite a question. "Should I be?" she asked, and found she meant the question honestly, curious what answer he would give rather than what answer courtesy demanded. "Most people are, once they understand what I am, what I carry. Most people," she said, "have never spent their whole life being afraid of nothing in particular, just for existing wrong in someone else's eyes. I think I've used up whatever fear I might have had for you on smaller, stupider things a long time ago." Something shifted behind his expression at that, something she could not quite name, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, the quiet stretching comfortably rather than awkwardly between them for the first time since they'd met. "No one knows with any certainty," he said finally, staring at his own hands. "The gray cloaks managed to slow it. They cannot stop it. They've told me as much since I was old enough to understand what that meant." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all, and simply sat with him in the settling quiet, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a long while neither of them spoke another word. It was, she would understand much later, the first moment the wary tolerance between them shifted quietly into something else entirely, something neither of them was yet ready to name aloud. It was 2 days later that she finally met his brother. Ronan looked enough like Kale to startle her at first glance. The same strong jaw, the same solid build, but harder somehow, his eyes carrying a bitterness Kale's had never once shown her. He found her alone in the eastern gardens, and there was nothing warm in his greeting. "So you're the one he chose," he said, looking her over the way one might appraise livestock at market. "I hope you understand what he gave up to make certain I'd be alive to resent him for it every day since." "I don't understand," she admitted honestly. "No," he said, already turning to leave. "You wouldn't." And he walked away, the weight of an old, tangled guilt trailing behind him like smoke from an unseen fire. She watched him go, unsettled by the encounter in a way she could not quite name, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of Ivy, of what it must be like to grow up standing permanently in someone else's light, to have your own worth measured only against a sibling's achievements rather than against anything you had built yourself. She had spent so long resenting her sister for being chosen, favored, seen. She wondered, watching Ronan's retreating back, whether Ivy had ever felt the way he clearly did now, and whether that shared, unspoken wound might have been something the two of them could have understood in each other, if either of them had ever thought to look for it. It was Rhys, finally, who delivered the last and largest piece of the puzzle to her that same evening, cornering her in a quiet corridor with the resigned expression of a man who had simply run out of ways to keep avoiding an inevitable conversation. "I am not the Crown Prince of Wolfmere," he said, without preamble. "I never have been. I am his cousin, wearing a magic that makes me appear and sound and even smell like the true heir, so that any assassin sent for the real prince finds me standing in his place instead." "Then who?" "Kale is the true Alpha Prince," Rhys said. "The heir. The one you actually married, whether or not you understood it at the time. The spell is called the Moonbound Vow. Only the person who signs the blood-bound oath alongside him can see through it, but only in dreams, never in waking life. That is why you have been dreaming of him since our wedding night. Your bond recognized him even when your own eyes could not." Alara stood very still, feeling the entire architecture of the last month rearrange itself violently around her. She had been lied to, not with malice. She understood even in that first flash of anger, but deliberately, thoroughly, by nearly every person she had slowly, carefully begun to trust in this cold, unfamiliar mountain. She found Kale that same night in the same training yard, and for once did not bother sparring with careful words before saying exactly what she meant. "You let me believe I had married Rhys. I let you believe whatever kept you alive longest," he said, meeting her eyes without flinching. "Anyone who knowingly marries Wolfmere's true heir becomes a target the moment the truth is known. I could not protect a target I hadn't yet decided to fully trust. And now..." He looked at her for a long, searching moment, silver flickering steadily now at the edges of the gold in his eyes. "Now I don't have much choice left in the matter," he said quietly. "I already trust you. I believe I have for weeks, if I'm honest with myself." She did not know what to do with the way that quiet admission settled warm and unwelcome in her chest, entirely too much like hope she had promised herself she would never allow to grow again. In the days that followed, the court itself seemed to shift subtly around her, as though word of what she now knew had traveled through Duskhaven's stone corridors faster than any messenger could carry it. Servants who had treated her with polite indifference now watched her with open curiosity. A steward who had once corrected her Wolfmere phrasing with barely concealed condescension began, instead, addressing her with careful deference, as though uncertain how much power she now quietly possessed simply by knowing the truth of who she had married. Kale did not change his training methods, but he changed, subtly, how he spoke to her during them. Less like a soldier drilling a reluctant recruit, more like a man teaching someone he intended to fight beside for a very long time. "You favor your right side when you're tired," he told her one evening, correcting her stance with a hand at her hip that lingered half a second longer than strictly necessary. "Your enemies will learn that faster than you'd like. Fix it now, while the cost of the lesson is only a bruise. Is that what this is? She asked. A lesson in becoming harder to kill. It's a lesson in becoming harder to lose, he said, and did not explain further, and she found she did not ask him to. Ronan, for his part, remained distant, though she noticed him watching the two of them from across the training yard more than once, arms crossed, expression unreadable. She caught him alone by the stables one gray afternoon and asked, plainly, why he seemed to resent a man who had given up half his own life to save him. Because gratitude and resentment aren't opposites, Ronan said, not looking at her, brushing down his horse with more force than the task required. You can carry both at once and drown just as easily in either one. Everyone expects me to only feel one of them. Nobody asks what it's like to feel both, every single day, for your whole life. It was the most honest thing he had said to her since they'd met, and Alara found herself, unexpectedly, understanding him a little better for it. A boy who had been saved at a cost he never asked to be paid, forced to live inside a debt he could never repay and never quite escape either. Chapter 4. The Cub Called Ash. Anger, she discovered, did not last nearly as long as she had expected it to, not once she understood the full shape of what Kale had actually been protecting her from since the moment they met. What lasted longer and burned hotter was the anger she felt toward her own father, sharpened now by direct comparison, a man who had never once lied to keep her safe, only to keep her useful to him. She stopped searching for the vault entirely. It happened without ceremony, without any single dramatic moment of decision she could point to afterward. She simply woke one gray morning and realized she had not thought of the seal in days, that the task her father had set her to complete now felt as though it belonged to some stranger's abandoned life rather than her own. Thornvale's throne could defend its own legitimacy through its own means. She was finished being the quiet, obedient hands that did it for him at personal risk. It was around this same time that a Ferox migration struck a border village half a day's hard ride from Duskhaven, and Kale rode out at the head of a company of guards to help with whatever remained. Alara insisted on riding with them, and for once, he did not bother arguing against her. The ride out took most of the morning, through country still green with early summer, and Alara found herself watching Kale in the saddle beside her, noting the way his whole posture changed the closer they drew to the affected village, shoulders squaring, eyes constantly scanning the treeline, the easy warmth he had begun to show her in private folded away somewhere beneath the armor of command. It was, she realized, the first time she had seen him fully as a soldier rather than as the man who taught her to fall without breaking, and something in her chest tightened with a fear she had not expected to feel on his behalf. The village was already a ruin by the time they arrived. The great, ancient wolf beasts had moved on hours before, leaving behind the particular devastation Ferox always left in their wake, buildings clawed open like overripe fruit, fear still hanging thick and metallic in the smoke-choked air. Survivors huddled in what remained of the village square, wrapped in whatever blankets the guards could spare, and Alara moved among them without waiting to be told to, offering water, steadying an old woman whose hands would not stop shaking, sitting for a long moment with a child too shocked to cry, who simply stared at nothing until Alara took his small hand in hers and held it until his eyes finally focused again. Kale watched her from across the square while directing his men through the wreckage and said nothing about it later, though she noticed, from then on, a new quality to the way he looked at her, something that had moved past simple respect into something closer to quiet awe. It was in the wreckage of what had once been a barn that Alara heard the sound, a thin, keening cry, unmistakably animal but carrying a grief she recognized instantly, viscerally, as something close to her own. She found the litter half buried in the wreckage. 3 Ferox cubs, already still and cold, killed by the collapse or by something crueler she did not let herself imagine, and beneath their mother's cooling body, one final cub still alive, small and trembling and streaked gray with ash from a fire that had swept through hours earlier. "Kill it," one of the older guards said flatly, already reaching for his blade. Even young, they grow into monsters no cage can hold. Alara looked at the trembling, terrified creature, its wide, frightened eyes fixed on her, and thought of every moment in her own life she had been dismissed and judged simply for existing in a shape someone else had already decided to fear before ever truly looking at her. "No," she said, and picked the cub up herself, cradling it gently against her chest despite the guard's audible protest. She named it Ash. Kale did not argue against her, though she caught the guards exchanging uneasy, disbelieving looks behind her back. He only watched her cradle the shivering creature close, something unreadable and thoughtful passing behind his shifting eyes as he watched her. "You understand what you're choosing to carry," he said quietly, once they were finally riding back toward Dusk Haven beneath a darkening sky. "I'm choosing not to kill something for the crime of what it might one day become," she said, meeting his gaze steadily. "I've had more than enough of being judged that same way myself, my whole life." He said nothing for a long while after that, and then, so quietly she nearly missed it entirely beneath the sound of hooves on packed earth. "I don't think you yet understand how much that single answer tells me about who you actually are, beneath everything else." She did not understand it then, not fully. She would in time. It was not long after their return to Dusk Haven that the fragile peace of the mountain court shattered entirely. A servant, bribed, it would later come to light, with promises of protection for her own frightened family, betrayed the location of a private meeting between Kale and Alara to King Bastion's soldiers. Alara had heard of Bastion only in fragments before that night, a king spoken of by his own court with a careful, guarded respect reserved for men whose temper was better left unprovoked, a father Kale rarely mentioned, and never with warmth. Seeing him in person for the first time, she understood immediately why. He carried none of Kale's careful restraint, none of the quiet consideration that governed even his son's most dangerous moments. Bastion moved through a room the way a storm moves through open country, indifferent to what stood in its path. Bastion, Kale's own father, arrived not with an army seeking his estranged son, but with a far colder purpose entirely. He had learned, through channels Alara did not yet understand, that a woman named Seraphine, long believed dead by nearly everyone in Nyxora, might have left behind a living trace of the rare and ancient silent bloodline somewhere within Thornvale's reach, and he intended to use whatever force necessary to find it, whatever the cost to anyone standing in his way. Alara did not yet know the name Seraphine meant anything to her at all. She would not have to wait long to learn otherwise. Ash, in the meantime, had settled into a strange and stubborn place in Alara's daily life, following her through the castle corridors with an awkward, loping gait that drew stares from every servant they passed. The cub slept curled against her at night, whimpering through dreams Alara could not begin to guess at, and grew, in the space of only a few weeks, with a speed that unsettled even Kale. "They grow fast when they're young," he told her, watching Ash tear happily through a pile of raked leaves in the courtyard, "and then the growing slows, and by the time they're grown, they're nearly impossible to kill. You've taken on something most of Nyxora spends its whole life running from." "Are you asking me to reconsider?" "No," he said, and something almost like a real smile touched his mouth. "I'm asking whether you understand that most people would call this reckless, and whether you care." "I stopped caring what most people would call things a long time ago," she said. "It's usually easier that way." He laughed then, a short, surprised sound she had not heard from him before, low and warm, and it startled her how much she wanted to hear it again. It was Talia, Kale's young sister, who took to Ash most readily of anyone in the castle, spending long afternoons in the courtyard teaching the cub to fetch sticks with a patience that made Alara like her immediately. Talia was perhaps 12, sharp-eyed and quick to laugh, entirely unburdened by the careful formality that governed most of the adults around her, and she asked Alara blunt, uncomplicated questions that no one else in Dusk Haven seemed willing to voice aloud. "Do you love my brother yet?" she asked one afternoon, without looking up from the stick she was preparing to throw. Alara nearly choked on her own breath. That's not a simple question. Most important questions aren't, Talia said, with the easy confidence of someone repeating words she'd heard an adult say once and decided she liked. You can just tell me when it stops being complicated. Alara had no answer for that, and Talia, apparently satisfied with the silence, threw the stick, and Ash bounded after it with a joy that seemed, for a little while, to hold the whole castle's tension at bay. Chapter 5. What the Beasts Remember. The Ferox migration that struck Duskhaven arrived earlier than anyone had prepared for, sweeping down out of the northern passes while Bastion soldiers were still moving quietly through the lower city, searching for a bloodline they did not yet realize slept inside the very girl they had already crossed paths with twice before. Alara had been in the lower market that morning, Talia at her side, choosing fabric for a dress the younger girl had been begging for weeks to have made, when the first horn sounded. She had heard Ferox horns described before, in stories, in Kale's careful briefings during her training, but nothing had prepared her for the sound itself, a deep, resonant cry that seemed to come from the mountain's own stone rather than any single watchtower, a sound that reached into her chest and turned her blood cold before her mind had even finished identifying what it meant. The city dissolved into chaos within minutes of the first horn blast, the deep, bone-shaking cry from the watchtowers, the frantic scramble of guards and terrified civilians alike, smoke already rising thick from the outer district where the first of the great beasts had broken clean through the outer wall. Alara grabbed Talia's hand and pulled her away from the market stalls, moving against the tide of fleeing people toward the castle rather than away from it, some instinct insisting that safety lay closer to Kale rather than farther from the chaos, and it was in that press of terrified bodies, in a narrow side street half-blocked with overturned carts, that Corwin finally found her. In the middle of that spreading chaos, Corwin appeared, having ridden hard and desperate from Thornvale under some thin pretense of retrieving Alara, though the moment he found her alone in a narrow side street, the pretense fell away from him entirely, discarded like a cloak too heavy to keep wearing. "Your father sent me for the seal," he said, blade already drawn and gleaming in the firelight. "And for you, Alara, if you'll come willingly. If not, you would hurt me over a piece of old metal sitting in a vault," she said, and something in her own voice must have carried the full, unmistakable weight of everything she had learned about herself in the past month, because Corwin's expression flickered, just once, with something close to shame before hardening back into grim resolve. The fight that followed was fast and ugly, nothing at all like the careful, structured sparring sessions she had shared with Kale. Corwin was well-trained and dangerously desperate in equal measure, but Alara had spent weeks learning to move like something other than prey, and when the critical moment finally came, she did not hesitate the way the old Alara might have. He fell in the smoke-filled street, and in his last breath, twisted his blade wildly toward Reese, who had come running at the sound of clashing steel. The wound would very nearly kill him, though he would, in time, slowly survive it. There was no time left to grieve or fully process what she had just done. The Ferox were already tearing further through the lower wall, and Kale was shouting orders across the chaos, pulling scattered guards into desperate formation, his eyes finding hers across the smoke and firelight with a look that told her everything before he spoke a single word aloud. "Get Talia and the cub and go," he said, pressing a worn leather cord into her shaking hand. A bracelet worked with a hidden, carefully stitched map. "Emberholt. If I haven't reached you by nightfall, run from Wolfmere entirely, and don't look back. Don't wait for me, whatever happens." "I'm not leaving you here." "You are," he said, and kissed her then, quick and fierce and entirely unplanned by either of them, the first time the two of them had allowed the thing steadily growing between them to become something neither could keep pretending was only duty. "Because I need to know you're alive somewhere in this world more than I need you standing beside me tonight." She ran because there was no other choice left to make. Talia's small, trembling hand gripped tight in hers, Ash cradled protectively against her side, and she did not allow herself to look back until she reached a hilltop nearly half a mile distant, in time to see an enormous ferox close its massive jaws around the very place she had last seen Kale standing his ground. The days that followed blurred together into a single, exhausting stretch of movement, sleeping in shallow hollows beneath fallen trees, rationing what little food they had managed to carry, Talia growing quieter and more withdrawn with each passing mile despite Alara's constant, gentle reassurance. Ash, though still young, seemed to sense the danger pressing close around them, staying alert through the nights in a way that let Alara finally sleep for an hour or two at a stretch, trusting the cub's sharper senses to warn her of anything approaching. She thought, more than once during those long, silent hours of walking, of turning back toward Duskhaven despite everything Kale had told her, of searching the wreckage herself for some sign that he had survived. She did not. She had promised him she would run, and some stubborn, aching part of her held to that promise even as every other part of her screamed against it. She told herself, over and over as she ran, that it did not mean what it looked like it meant. She told herself that for a long, terrible time afterward. It was in the wild, uncharted lands beyond Duskhaven's borders, 3 exhausting days later, hungry and half-starved and running on nothing but sheer stubborn will, that a ferox pack finally caught her scent on the wind, and instead of attacking, surrounded her in an uncanny, watchful silence, as though guarding her rather than hunting her down. Alara stood frozen in the center of them, Ash pressed silent and trembling against her chest, and on the wind, faint and utterly impossible, she heard a woman's voice she had not heard since she was far too young to hold any clear memory of it at all. Mother, she thought, and the thought terrified her far more than the circling ferox ever could have. What am I? The pack held its silent formation around her for what felt like hours, though the sun barely moved in the sky above the treeline. Talia pressed close against her side, too frightened to speak, and Ash, grown enough now to stand nearly to Alara's hip, planted himself between her and the largest of the ferox, hackles raised, a low growl building in his throat that the massive creature answered not with aggression but with something almost like patience, as though indulging a pup's instinct to protect. One of the ferox, older than the rest, its muzzle scarred pale with age, lowered its great head until its eyes were level with Alara's own. She did not move. She could not have said, afterward, whether it was courage or simple paralysis that kept her still, but something in her chest reached toward the creature without her permission, some wordless current passing between them, and the ferox exhaled once, a great gusting breath that stirred her hair, and then, as one, the entire pack turned and melted back into the treeline as silently as they had appeared. Alara sank to her knees in the sudden absence of them, shaking, Talia's arms wrapping tight around her a moment later. They knew you, Talia whispered. Didn't they? They knew you. I don't know what they knew, Alara said, though even as she said it, she understood it was not entirely true. Something in her had recognized something in them, and she did not yet have language for what that meant. Only the cold, certain knowledge that her life had just changed in a way she could not undo by pretending otherwise. They walked for another full day before the gray cloak found them, and in that day Alara said little, turning the encounter over and over in her mind, searching every corner of her own memory for some explanation and finding none. She thought of her mother, whom she had never known, a woman whose face existed only in a single faded portrait in the Thornvale Gallery that her father had never once allowed anyone to move or discuss. She thought of the strange, half-buried grief that sometimes crossed her father's face when he thought no one was watching. She did not yet have the pieces to make sense of any of it. She only knew, with a certainty that frightened her, that the pieces existed and that she was standing closer to them than she had ever stood before. Chapter 6. The Woman Who Loved a Cruel King. The gray cloak found her 2 days later, Drawn by scattered reports of a lone traveler the Ferox had inexplicably let pass unharmed through territory that had claimed entire armed war parties in the past. She expected to be killed on sight. Instead, she was questioned, carefully, methodically, by a robed woman who introduced herself only as Sister Marrow and studied Alara with the particular, unnerving intensity of someone searching for confirmation of a suspicion already half-formed long before they met. "You carry something," Marrow said finally, after a long silence. "Something old and something rare. I don't yet know whether you understand that about yourself." "I don't understand what you mean," Alara said, and meant it completely. Alara told her, haltingly, about the pack that had surrounded her in the wild lands, about the voice on the wind, about the strange, wordless current that had passed between herself and the scarred old Ferox that had lowered its head to meet her eyes. She had expected disbelief, or alarm, or the kind of careful, managing calm adults used on children who claimed to have seen something impossible. Marrow offered none of those things. She only nodded slowly, as though confirming something she had already privately suspected, and said nothing further on the matter for the rest of that evening, letting the silence settle rather than rushing to fill it with explanation. Marrow did not press further. Not that first day. But she did not let Alara go free, either. Not quite a prisoner, but not fully free to leave, kept close within the traveling gray cloak order, while quiet messages passed back and forth toward Duskhaven that Alara had no way to intercept or understand. It was during those strange, suspended days of waiting that Alara finally learned, in careful fragments told to her by Marrow across quiet evening fires, the full story of her mother. Seraphine had come to Nyxora young, Marrow explained. A wanderer from lands even the wolf kingdoms did not fully map on any chart, and had fallen in love, foolishly, completely, without reservation, with a prince named Alaric, long before he ever became the cold and distant King Alara had grown up fearing. Marrow spoke of Seraphine with something close to reverence in her voice, a woman who had carried a gift so rare that the gray cloaks themselves had feared and coveted it in nearly equal measure. She belonged to a bloodline called the Silent, those rare few able to reach directly into the minds of Ferox, to calm them, to guide them, to understand what the rest of Nyxora had spent centuries mistakenly believing were nothing more than mindless monsters. Marrow described her once, in a rare, unguarded moment, as a woman who laughed easily and often, who had a habit of humming old traveling songs under her breath while she walked, who had charmed half the gray cloak order simply by treating every one of them, robes and titles and all, like ordinary people worth knowing. She had not sought out Alaric, Marrow said. She had stumbled into him, quite by accident, at a border market where he had gone in disguise to see his father's kingdom the way ordinary people saw it, and the two of them had talked for 6 hours straight before either one thought to ask the other's name. It was not, Marrow insisted, the story of a naive girl swept away by a crown. It was the story of two people who simply recognized something rare in each other and had the good sense not to let it go, a recognition Alara found herself thinking of, more than once in the weeks that followed, whenever she watched Kale cross a room toward her. "It is a gift with a terrible history behind it," Marrow said, staring into the fire. "Long ago, a corrupted king used a captured Silent to weaponize an entire Ferox horde against his own political rivals. Thousands died in a single night. The Grey Cloaks were founded in the ashes of that slaughter, sworn ever since to two sacred duties: to guard the moonbound magic that protects royal heirs from assassination, and to watch, always and carefully, for the return of silent blood, so that such a horror is never permitted to repeat itself." What happened to her? To Seraphine in the end? Marrow's face grew visibly shadowed. She had a daughter with Alaric. And not long after, she began to experience visions, a separate gift called sight, that ran alongside her silent bloodline. Visions of the Grey Cloaks eventually coming for her child, and of her own death soon after. When we finally did come, it was not to kill her, understand. It was to claim her power for the crown's use, to register and control it the way one carefully controls a dangerous weapon. She refused outright. She called an entire Ferox horde to defend herself and her infant daughter, and in doing so, burned something vital inside her own body beyond any hope of repair. Alaric held her as she died in his arms. He did not leave her side for 2 full days afterward, even once the priests came to take her body for the pyre. Alara sat in silence for a long while after that, the fire crackling low and steady beside her, trying and failing to reconcile the cold, distant king she had grown up fearing with a man who had once, apparently, loved someone enough to sit beside a body for 2 days rather than let her lie alone in death. Why, she finally asked, her voice unsteady, did he never once tell me any of this himself? I imagine, Marrow said gently, watching her carefully, that he has spent your entire life since terrified of losing you the exact same way he lost her. It was not forgiveness. It was not even close to forgiveness yet, but it was, for the very first time in Alara's life, the beginning of something like understanding, and she found she could not decide, sitting there by the fire, whether that understanding felt more like a gift or an open wound. There were harder days too, in that stretch of waiting, nights when Alara woke from dreams that were not Kale's silver-eyed face but her mother's, faceless and burning, a warning she could not fully interpret no matter how long she sat with it by the fire afterward. Marrow found her awake more than once in those small hours and simply sat with her without demanding explanation, offering the same steady, undemanding presence she had offered from the start. Fear is not a flaw in the gift, Marrow told her once. It is simply proof you understand the weight of what you carry. Your mother felt it too, every day, and it never once made her less capable of wielding it well. Marrow gave her the journal's existence only as a rumor at first, a mention, in passing, that Seraphine had kept a private record in her final years, one the Grey Cloaks had never managed to recover before it vanished from Thornvale entirely. Alara asked, every evening after that, whether any further word had come of it, and every evening Marrow answered the same way, gently but firmly. Patience, child. Some things cannot be rushed toward. In the daylight hours, while they waited for further instruction from the Grey Cloak's distant elders, Marrow began, almost without seeming to intend it, teaching Alara small things, how to sit with her breathing steady even when her thoughts were not, how to notice the particular quality of silence that settled over a room when a Ferox was near even miles away, long before any scout could confirm it. Alara did not know, at first, that these were the first lessons of the silent bloodline, offered so carefully and indirectly that she mistook them for simple kindness. You've been teaching me something, she said finally, on the 4th evening, watching Marrow's face for confirmation. I have, Marrow admitted. I did not want to name it before you were ready to hear the name. Some gifts are easier to carry if you've already learned to hold their weight before you understand what you're holding. And now, am I ready? Marrow studied her for a long moment, firelight catching the silver threading through her dark hair. No one is ever fully ready, she said. Your mother wasn't. I don't imagine you will be either. But you are stronger than you know, and braver than your quiet years in Thornvale ever gave you room to prove. I think that will have to be enough. It was not entirely comforting, but Alara found, turning the words over as she finally drifted toward sleep that night, that she believed them anyway. Chapter 7. The Weight Two Brothers Carry. Marrow released her within the week, escorting her personally part of the way toward Emberholt with a small guard, once it became unmistakably clear that whatever power slept quietly in Alara's blood was not something the Ferox intended to let anyone harm on their watch. The reunion with Kale, when it finally came, arrived in the chaotic middle of a Bari wolf ambush in the Bone Grove, Alara and her small party caught between rock and a snarling pack of lesser predators drawn in by the scent of blood and fear, when Kale appeared out of the dense treeline like something summoned by will alone, cutting through the ambush with a raw violence that told her, far more clearly than any words could have managed, exactly how afraid he had been that she was already dead. She learned, in the retelling that came later, exactly what those 3 days had cost him, that he had left Duskhaven within hours of the Ferox retreating, refusing every attempt by his own council to slow him down with proper escort or planning, riding nearly without rest through territory still crawling with scattered predators drawn out by the chaos. He had not slept, she gathered from the exhausted state of the men who had ridden with him, and had barely eaten, driven by something that had very little to do with duty and everything to do with a particular, singular fear of losing the one thing in his life he had not yet learned how to protect from a distance. He did not hide it from the men accompanying him, either. In front of every soldier, every watching gray cloak, every witness gathered in that grove, he pulled her firmly against him and declared, plainly and without hesitation, that this was Wolfmir's true and rightful queen, that the long game of hidden princes and borrowed faces was finished for good. It should have felt like an unambiguous triumph. Instead, Alara watched with growing dread over the following days as dark veins spread further up Kale's throat, the fading flame advancing faster now than the exhausted gray cloak's rituals could reliably hold it back. When a sudden skirmish broke out near their traveling camp days later, Alara watched him lose himself almost entirely to the curse's raw strength, tearing through the attacking guards with a ferocity that left even his own hardened soldiers backing carefully away from him, and afterward, watched him stare down at his own blood-soaked hands with an expression of pure, unguarded horror. "This is what it will eventually do to me," he said quietly that night, unable to meet her eyes. "Take everything I am, and leave only the fire behind wearing my face." It was Ronan, finally, who broke the heavy stalemate of guilt and grief that had settled thick over the entire camp like a fog that refused to lift. He had been distant since their tense reunion, watching his twin brother's slow decline with an expression Alara had first mistaken for simple indifference and now understood, with growing clarity, was something far closer to unbearable, festering guilt. Ronan sought out a gray cloak elder in private one evening and made a request that visibly horrified the old priest, to take a portion of the fading flame directly into his own body, to lighten, even slightly, the burden his brother had carried entirely alone since they were both children too young to understand what such a bargain would cost. It was not a full cure by any measure. The ritual left Ronan permanently marked with faint traces of the same dark veins, a lasting reminder etched visibly into his own skin from that night forward, but it drew enough of the curse's crushing weight from Kale that his strength finally stabilized, his color slowly returning, the terrible acceleration of his decline at last slowing to something survivable, something manageable again. When Kale woke to understand fully what his brother had willingly done for him, the two of them sat together outside the healer's tent for hours afterward, saying very little at first, years of buried resentment and guilt slowly unraveling between them in a way no single rushed conversation could ever have managed on its own. Alara watched from a respectful distance, understanding instinctively that she was witnessing something that belonged only to the two brothers and did not intrude on it. Later, once Ronan had finally gone to rest, exhausted from the ritual, Kale found her sitting alone near the edge of the camp and settled down beside her without a word, resting his head briefly against her shoulder in a gesture of pure, uncomplicated exhaustion she had not seen from him before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for not making me carry this one alone either." "You were never going to carry it alone," she said. "Not anymore." He lifted his head to look at her then, something raw and unguarded in his expression, and she understood, in that quiet moment, that whatever careful walls either of them had maintained since the day they met had finally, fully come down. It was that same quiet night. Sorting through the modest belongings salvaged from Duskhaven before the Ferox attack had scattered everyone, that Alara found a small, worn leather journal tucked carefully among Kale's few possessions, one that Marrow, upon seeing it, identified instantly as belonging to Seraphine, smuggled quietly out of Thornvale years earlier, and passed hand to hand through careful gray cloak circles until it finally found its way into safekeeping. Alara opened it with hands that would not quite stop shaking. Before that, though, there was the reunion itself to survive, the aftermath of the ambush, the camp reassembling itself in the Bone Grove's uneasy quiet, wounds tended and fires lit against the deepening cold. Alara sat beside Kale that first night while a healer stitched a shallow cut along his forearm, and found she could not stop looking at him, as though her eyes needed to keep confirming, over and over, that he was actually there, actually breathing, actually whole enough to be angry at for the reckless way he'd thrown himself into the ambush without waiting for reinforcements. "You could have died," she said, once the healer had finished and left them alone by the fire. "So could you," he said. "And yet here we both are, having this argument instead of not having it, which I'd call a fair trade. That isn't funny." "No," he agreed, and the humor dropped from his voice entirely. "It isn't. I spent 3 days not knowing whether you were alive, Alara. I am allowed one bad joke in exchange for that." She said nothing to that, only reached over and took his uninjured hand in both of hers, and they sat like that for a long while, the fire popping softly, neither of them needing to fill the silence with anything further. It was Talia, exhausted and finally safe, who fell asleep first that night, curled against Alara's side with Ash stretched protectively across both their feet, and it was watching the girl sleep, safe and breathing steadily, that something in Alara's chest finally allowed itself to unclench for the first time since the attack on Duskhaven had begun. Whatever came next, whatever her mother's blood meant, whatever the Ferox recognized in her, she understood, watching Talia's small chest rise and fall in the firelight, that she would face it. She had already survived worse than she believed herself capable of. She could survive this too. Chapter 8. A Crown Without Chains. The journal was not long, but it held everything Marrow's careful stories had only ever sketched the outline of, Seraphine's own voice at last, written in careful, looping script, describing her love for Alaric, her mounting fear as her visions of the future grew steadily darker, and, in the final written pages, a message clearly meant for a daughter she had already known, with growing certainty that she would never live to raise herself. If you are reading this, my love, then some part of what I feared has come to pass, and some part of what I hoped for has come to pass alongside it in equal measure. You carry what I carried. I am sorry for the weight of it, and I am not sorry at all, because it means some piece of me still walks quietly beside you through the world. Trust it. Trust yourself, always, above anyone else's fear of what you might become. Your father loved me more than his own crown, more than his own life, and he will love you the very same way, even if grief has made him forget, for a while, how to properly show it to you. Forgive him when you are finally ready to, not for his sake, for yours alone. The earlier pages, before the final message meant for her daughter, were filled with smaller things, observations about the Ferox that contradicted everything Nyxora believed about them, notes on the particular resonance Seraphine felt when the Silent Stones were near, brief, aching entries about Alaric that made him sound, for the first time in Alara's imagining of him, like a young man rather than a king. There was one entry, dated only a season before Alara's birth, that she returned to and read a third time before she could make herself move on. He asked me today what I would want for our daughter if she inherits what I carry. I told him I would want her to know she was never a burden, never a danger, never something to be hidden away out of fear. I would want her to know that the same blood that frightens kings is the same blood that let me hear the grief in a dying creature's mind and ease it, that let me stop a slaughter before it began. Power is only ever as dangerous as the fear surrounding it. I hope, whatever comes, that she is raised without that fear. I hope, if I am not there to raise her myself, that someone remembers to tell her this. Alara read it twice through, tears she did not bother trying to hide, and understood. All at once and completely, the full shape of everything laid before her. Her mother's gift and her mother's death, her father's long years of cold protection disguised so poorly as neglect, the gray cloak's patient vigilance across generations, the ancient silent stones Marrow had mentioned once in passing, said to be hidden carefully beneath both Thornvale and Duskhaven, artifacts tied directly to the very bloodline she now understood, undeniably and completely, that she herself carried. She did not tell Cale that first night. She sat alone with the knowledge instead, afraid of what it truly meant for her future, afraid of becoming exactly the kind of power that got weaponized, or hunted relentlessly, or burned alive slowly from the inside the way her own mother had been before her. But she found him regardless at the edge of camp, drawn there by something she could not fully name even to herself, and they stood together at the lip of a cliff overlooking the dark, sprawling spread of the Bone Grove below, close enough now that the careful distance between them had long since stopped feeling like distance at all, and started feeling instead like something they were both, slowly and deliberately, choosing to close for good. "I keep thinking," Cale said quietly into the cool night air, "about the very first time I saw you, standing in that courtyard, looking at everything around you as though you were simply waiting to be told, once again, that you didn't quite belong there. And now," she asked, "now I think you belong exactly wherever you decide to stand," he said, turning to face her fully, silver flooding steadily into his eyes beneath the pale moonlight. "I chose you originally because the old law allowed me to. I kept choosing you afterward because I genuinely wanted to. I don't think I've been fully honest with either of us about how much, until this very moment." She closed the remaining distance between them herself this time, and the kiss that followed was unhurried and certain, nothing at all like the desperate, fear-soaked one they had shared before the Ferox attack tore them apart. This one felt like a quiet answer instead of an anxious question, like two people finally, openly admitting something that had been steadily true between them for weeks already. When they finally drew apart, Cale rested his forehead lightly against hers, and for a while neither of them spoke, content simply to stand together at the cliff's edge with the whole dark valley spread out below, the future waiting somewhere beyond it, unwritten and, for the first time in either of their lives, something they intended to write together rather than have decided for them. "I used to think," he said quietly, "that the fading flame meant I could never let myself want anything too much. That wanting something only made the leaving of it harder when the curse finally caught up with me. And now I think I'd rather have this, however long it lasts, than 100 careful years of never once wanting anything at all," he said. "I think your mother would have understood that better than most people ever could." Far off in the darkness, faint on the cold wind, a lone ferox howled long and low, and Alara felt something deep in her own chest answer the call entirely without her permission, a resonance, a flicker of recognition, something ancient and long dormant slowly stirring awake inside her. She did not tell him, not yet. She was still too afraid of what it might mean for both of them. The days that followed carried a fragile, unfamiliar softness Alara had never once experienced in Thornvale. Mornings that began with Cale's hand finding hers before either of them had fully woken, evenings spent in quiet conversation that had nothing to do with treaties or curses or ancient bloodlines, only the small, ordinary business of two people learning each other properly for the first time. She learned that he disliked sweet wine and loved bitter tea, that he had taught himself to read using his mother's old ledgers because no one had thought to teach his second son anything beyond sword work, that he still, after everything, felt a flicker of guilt every time he watched Ronan favor the arm marked by the shared curse. She told him, in turn, about the Thornvale dinners she had endured in silence for years, about the small rebellious satisfaction of memorizing treaties nobody thought to ask her opinion on, about the particular loneliness of being loved carelessly rather than not at all, which she had once believed was the same thing and now understood, watching the careful way Cale listened to her, was not the same thing at all. Marrow watched the two of them with an expression Alara could not quite read, something between approval and concern, as though she saw a future neither of them had yet considered. "Be careful," Marrow said to her once, privately, while Kale was occupied elsewhere in the camp. "Not of him. Of what you're becoming." Love and power arriving in the same season can be a dangerous combination if you don't learn to hold them separately. "Is that a warning?" "It's what I would have told your mother if I'd had the chance," Marrow said. "I didn't. I'm giving it to you instead." Alara carried the words with her afterward, turning them over the way she turned over everything Marrow told her, and found, in the end, that she understood the warning without letting it frighten her out of what she had already, quietly, chosen. Chapter 9. The Voice in the Vision. The vision came 3 restless nights later, sudden and vivid enough that Alara woke gasping for breath, Kale's steady hand already on her shoulder before her eyes had even fully opened in the dark. She had seen Ronan clearly, standing alone before a full Ferox horde, the dark veins of the fading flame's shared burden glowing faintly along his exposed skin, the great ancient beasts approaching him not with violence, but with something disturbingly close to reverence instead. And she had heard, unmistakably and impossibly, one of them speak aloud, not with any wolf's natural voice, but with something low and resonant that belonged to no throat she understood, a single word directed with unnerving precision toward her, though she stood nowhere physically near the vision itself as it unfolded. "My queen." She told Kale absolutely everything then. The journal, her mother's hidden gift, the strange resonance she had felt that night at the cliff's edge, the vision she had just violently woken from moments before. He listened without once looking away from her face, and when she finally finished speaking, braced instinctively for fear or sudden distance, he only pulled her closer against him instead, without hesitation. "Then we find out together exactly what it means," he said firmly. "Starting right now, tonight." They spent that night poring over what fragments Marrow could offer them of old gray cloak records concerning visions and the silent bloodline, searching for any precedent, any account of a gift that seemed to move between 2 people bound as closely as Alara and Kale now were. Marrow found little that satisfied them fully, only old, half-legible references to bonded sight, a phenomenon so rare the Order had recorded barely 3 instances of it across 4 centuries, always between people whose lives had become, through blood or oath or simple devotion, deeply entangled with one another. "It seems," Marrow said carefully, "that the depth of what exists between the 2 of you may have opened something in you that would otherwise have stayed dormant far longer. Visions ordinarily come slowly, gradually over years. Yours arrived within months. Is that dangerous?" Kale asked, his hand tightening slightly around Alara's. "Everything about this bloodline is dangerous, if handled carelessly," Marrow said. "But I do not think this is the danger to fear. I think it is simply proof of how deeply you have already chosen each other, whether either of you fully realized it yet." Alara said nothing to that, but she felt Kale's hand find hers beneath the table, and did not pull away. The search itself took most of that week, following faint traces Marrow helped them track, old campsites, disturbed ground, the particular quality of unease that lingered in places where a silent had recently passed. Alara found herself, during the long hours of writing, practicing the small skills Marrow had begun teaching her, reaching out tentatively toward the wildlife around their path, feeling for the first faint edges of the same current she had felt with the Ferox pack weeks before. It was slow, uncertain work, more failure than success, but by the 4th day she managed to calm a startled hawk enough that it landed briefly on a branch beside their camp rather than fleeing, and the small victory left her almost giddy, with something like hope. Kale watched her practice with quiet, careful attention, never pushing, never doubting, offering only steady encouragement when her frustration threatened to overwhelm her. "You're doing in days what most silent take years to manage," he told her one evening, watching her coax a nervous fox close enough to eat from her outstretched palm. "I don't think you understand yet how remarkable that is." "I don't feel remarkable," she admitted. I feel like I'm fumbling through the dark and occasionally getting lucky. That's what remarkable looks like from the inside, he said. Most people just don't get to see their own progress as clearly as I get to see yours. They found Ronan within the week, deep in territory Wolfmere's own scouts rarely bothered to patrol, exactly as the vision had shown her days earlier, engaged in careful, secretive contact with a small, wary Ferox pack, guided there under mounting pressure from his own father. Bastian, deposed from open command but far from truly finished politically, had discovered his younger son's newly dormant silent potential, unexpectedly awoken by the small fragment of the fading flame Ronan now permanently carried, and had spent weeks patiently working to convince him that this new power represented an opportunity far too valuable to simply waste. A genuine chance to finally step fully out from beneath his more celebrated brother's long shadow and build something entirely his own at last. Ronan did not deny any of it once confronted directly. "You don't understand what it's like," he said, raw and completely unguarded in a way Alara had never once seen from him before. "Spending your entire life known only as the twin who was saved, nothing more. He offered me a real way to finally be something else entirely. An army built on a stolen gift was never yours to begin with," Kale said quietly, without judgment in his voice. "It would only ever be his. You'd simply become the leash he uses to hold and direct it." Ronan said nothing for a long, heavy moment, visibly torn between years of carefully buried resentment and the fragile new trust that had only just begun, slowly, to mend between the two brothers. It was Alara, finally, who spoke gently into the silence, understanding better than either brother what it truly felt like to be offered power as a poor substitute for simply being seen and valued. "I spent my entire life being the daughter nobody ever bothered to look at twice," she said quietly. "I understand completely the temptation to take whatever power finally makes people actually look at you, but it never actually fills the hole it promises to fill inside you. It only ever gives you a worse, more permanent reason to be afraid of what you might become." Something in Ronan's carefully guarded expression finally cracked open, the old bitterness giving way at last to something raw and much closer to genuine grief. "I don't want to be my father's weapon," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I only ever wanted, just once in my life, to matter as much as Kale naturally does to everyone around him." "You already do," Kale said, and meant every word of it completely, and Alara watched years, perhaps an entire lifetime, of quiet resentment finally begin to unknot between the two brothers, standing together in a clearing that had very nearly become a battlefield between them instead. Bastion soldiers, watching this exchange from a distance, did not immediately withdraw. For a long, tense moment, it seemed the confrontation might turn violent despite everything, hands drifting toward hilts, the Ferox pack behind Ronan shifting restlessly at the sudden charge in the air. It was Kale who finally stepped forward, unarmed, palms open, and addressed the soldiers directly rather than their absent king. "You didn't ride out here to die for a warrior king started out of his own ambition," he said, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "Go home. Tell him his son chose differently than he expected. That's not a crime any of you need to answer for with your lives." Slowly, uncertainly, the soldiers began to withdraw, and the tension in the clearing broke, like a held breath finally released. Ronan watched them go with an expression Alara could not fully read, relief and grief tangled together in equal measure, the last threads of his father's expectations finally, irrevocably cut. That night, around a small fire built well away from the Ferox pack that still watched them from the tree-lean with wary, patient eyes, Ronan finally spoke to Alara without bitterness for the first time since they'd met. "I owe you an apology," he said, staring into the flames rather than at her. "I judged you before I understood anything about you. I decided you were just another convenient piece in whatever game the crown was playing, and I let that decision color everything since." "You had reason to be careful," she said. I understand that better than you might think. Careful is one thing. Cruel is another. I was closer to the second than I'd like to admit. He glanced at her then, something almost boyish in the gesture. For what it's worth, I think my brother chose well. I didn't think that at first. I think it now. That's worth quite a lot, actually, she said, and meant it. Cale found the two of them still talking quietly by the fire an hour later, and something in his expression, surprise, relief, a cautious, unguarded hope, told Alara more clearly than any words could have how much this fragile reconciliation between his brother and the woman he loved meant to him. He said nothing about it, only settled beside Alara and let his shoulder rest against hers, and the three of them sat together beneath the wide, star-scattered sky until the fire burned low, the ferox beyond the treeline settling into their own watchful rest, as though the whole valley had finally, briefly, found something like peace. Chapter 10. 2 Thrones, 1 Choice. Bastian did not accept his growing defeat quietly. Word reached them within days that he had mobilized whatever remained of his loyal soldiers, fully intent on seizing the ferox pack Ronan had made contact with, prepared to force the bonding through open violence if patient persuasion had ultimately failed him. The final confrontation came at dawn, in a wide gray valley beneath Duskhaven's mountain, Bastion's remaining forces arrayed in grim, determined formation against a ferox horde already agitated and dangerous, caught helplessly in the crossfire of a war none of them had ever asked to be part of. The night before the confrontation, the small camp gathered around a single fire in tense, unspoken anticipation of what the dawn would bring. Cale found Alara standing apart from the others, staring out into the darkness, where Bastion's forces were rumored to be massing, and came to stand beside her without a word. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said finally, "I need you to know that none of it changes what I already know to be true. You are not a weapon, Alara. Not to me. Not to Wolfmere. Not to anyone who matters. You can't promise that the rest of the world will see it the same way," she said quietly. "No," he agreed. "But I can promise you that I will spend the rest of my life making sure the world learns to. That's not nothing." She turned to face him fully then, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything they had survived together. The lies, the training yard, the ferox, the losses, the slow unfolding of a love neither had expected to find in a marriage built on old law rather than choice, settling between them like something solid enough to hold on to. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, echoing his words back to him, "I'm glad it's you standing beside me for it." Alara stepped into that valley the next morning without armor, without any weapon at all, carrying only the quiet certainty her mother's journal had finally given her permission to fully feel for the first time. She reached out toward the horde the way something instinctive and ancient inside her had always somehow known how to, though she had never once consciously practiced it before, and felt the wild, snarling chaos of dozens of ancient minds slowly, gradually, begin to still beneath her steady presence. Beside her, Ronan did the very same, turning his own newly discovered gift not toward conquest as his father had hoped, but toward mercy instead, reaching carefully into the minds of soldiers Bastion had whipped into a desperate battle frenzy and gently easing them back from a violence they had, in truth, never actually wanted any real part of. Bastion watched his entire careful plan unravel from the exposed center of a valley that no longer obeyed his commands, and when Wolfmere's own ruling council arrived moments later, alerted by frightened scouts, furious at a former king who had nearly dragged his kingdom into an unnecessary war for the sake of personal power alone, his throne ended not in one final battle, but in quiet disgrace instead, stripped from him decisively by the very lords who had once knelt willingly before him. In the chaos of the valley's final moments, Bastion turned on his own sons one last time, and it was Ronan, not Cale, who stepped forward to meet him. "You are supposed to be mine," Bastion said, something almost like genuine bewilderment beneath the fury in his voice, as though he could not fully understand how the son he had spent months quietly courting had ended up standing against him instead of beside him. "I was never yours to use," Ronan said, and his voice did not shake. "I spent my whole life believing I owed someone a debt I could never repay. I don't owe you anything at all." Bastian had no answer for that. The council's guards took him without further struggle, and Ronan stood watching his father led away with an expression that held grief and relief in equal, complicated measure. The particular sorrow of finally, fully letting go of a parent who had never once deserved the holding on. Alara found him afterward, apart from the celebration already beginning to stir through the valley, and said nothing at first, only stood beside him the way he had once, grudgingly, allowed her to. "It's strange," he said eventually. "I spent so long wanting to matter as much as Kale. I don't think I understood until today that I already did. I just needed to stop looking for it from the one person who was never going to give it to me honestly. That's most of growing up, I think," she said. "Learning where not to look anymore." He almost smiled at that, the first real one she'd seen from him, and together they walked back to join the others. Kale took the throne that had always, truly, rightfully been his own, no longer needing the moon-bound Vow's borrowed face to protect him from anything. Rhys, fully recovered now from his wound, stood proudly at the new king's right hand, not as a decoy any longer, but as the trusted, valued advisor he had quietly always been beneath the surface of the old magic, finally free at last to live a life that belonged entirely and completely to himself. King Alaric traveled to Duskhaven himself for the coronation, older and visibly more tired than Alara had ever once seen him look before. And in the quiet stillness after the ceremony ended, he found her alone on a balcony overlooking the valley where the Ferox had finally gone still and silent, resting at peace at last. "I read the journal," she told him, before he could speak first. "I know now exactly why you did what you did all those years. I don't think I forgive you yet, not fully. But I understand you now. That is more than I ever truly thought I'd earn from you," he said quietly, and for the first time in her entire life, Alara saw something like grief and love tangled together plainly in her father's eyes, rather than the familiar cold distance she had grown up expecting from him. It was not full reconciliation, not yet, not completely, but it was a door left deliberately open, where before there had only ever been a solid wall between them, and for now, standing together on that quiet balcony with the valley settling into evening below, an open door felt like enough for both of them. The coronation itself was unlike anything Duskhaven had seen in a generation, the great mountain hall packed with lords from both kingdoms who had spent centuries regarding each other with wary suspicion, now standing shoulder to shoulder beneath banners bearing both the Wolf of Wolfmere and the Thorn of Thornvale, stitched together for the occasion into a single, unified crest. Talia insisted on walking Ash down the center aisle before the ceremony began, to the great amusement of the assembled court, and Ronan stood at his brother's side as first witness, the faint dark veins along his forearm visible beneath his formal sleeve, worn now not as a hidden shame, but as a mark he had, in his own quiet way, learned to carry with something like pride. Rhys spoke the traditional blessing over the new king and queen, his voice steady and clear in a way it had never quite managed to be while wearing another man's borrowed face, and Alara thought, watching him, that she had never seen him look more entirely himself. Thornvale and Wolfmere, in the months that slowly followed, forged a lasting peace neither kingdom had managed to hold on to in centuries. The ancient silent stones hidden beneath both castles placed carefully under joint protection at last, a solemn promise etched into both treaty and stone alike that the rare power sleeping quietly in Alara's blood would never again become something any crown could weaponize for its own gain. On a quiet evening, months later, Alara stood beside Kale on the very same cliff where he had first kissed her beneath the moonlight. Ash, grown now into a loyal, watchful companion nearly the size of a small horse, settled contentedly at her feet, and felt, For the very first time in her entire life, the full and total absence of anything she still needed to hide from anyone. No borrowed face left to maintain. No stolen name to answer to. No careful silence she had to shrink herself down small enough to fit safely inside anymore. She thought, sometimes, of the girl she had been at that Thornvale dinner table, waiting for a voice she would never be given, and found she could look back at that girl now not with pity, but with something gentler, recognition, perhaps, or gratitude, for all the quiet years of watching and learning that had somehow, despite everything, prepared her for the woman she had since become. She had spent so long believing that being overlooked meant being unworthy of being seen. She understood now that it had only ever meant she had been standing in the wrong rooms, waiting for the wrong people to finally notice her. It had taken a foreign court, a curse, a war, and a stranger with silver eyes to teach her that lesson, but she had learned it all the same, and she did not intend to forget it again. Ivy wrote to her that autumn, the first real letter the two of them had exchanged in years, full of small, ordinary news. A courtship of her own beginning to bloom back in Thornvale, complaints about their father's continuing stubbornness, a hesitant, sincere line near the end that read simply, "I am proud of you, and I don't think I ever told you that when it might have mattered more." Alara read it twice, and wrote back the same night, longer than she had intended, filling 3 full pages with everything she had never found the words to say to her sister while they still shared the same roof, and found, in the slow rebuilding of that fractured relationship, one more small piece of the life she had never quite believed she was allowed to want. She carried her mother's gift now not as a burden thrust unfairly upon her, but as an inheritance she had finally, deliberately chosen to claim for herself, a responsibility and a genuine strength both at once, woven together the way love and power always seemed to intertwine throughout her family's long and complicated history. Somewhere far beyond the valley, faint on the cool evening wind, a lone ferox called out once into the gathering dark, and Alara did not flinch at the familiar sound any more the way she once might have. She understood it fully now, the same way she finally understood herself. Not a curse, not a warning sent to frighten her, simply a voice, finally, being properly heard after so long. Kale's hand found hers in the comfortable quiet between them, and together, king and queen of 2 kingdoms now finally at lasting peace with one another, they turned back toward the distant, welcoming lights of Duskhaven, walking side by side toward a shared future neither of them would ever again have to face, wearing anyone else's shadow. There would be difficult days still ahead of them, she knew, the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust between 2 kingdoms with centuries of suspicion between them, the ongoing search for the 3rd silent stone still hidden somewhere in Duskhaven's own foundations, the careful balance of a gift that would always demand respect rather than carelessness. Ronan would need guidance as his own power continued to grow. Rhys would need time to learn who he was outside the shape of someone else's face. Her father would need patience she was not yet certain she had fully found. But none of it frightened her the way uncertainty once had, back when she was a girl who had learned to expect nothing and ask for even less. Behind them, Ash gave a low, contented rumble and fell into step at their heels, and Talia's laughter drifted faintly up from the courtyard below, and somewhere in the castle a fire was already being lit against the coming evening chill. Nyxora would go on turning the way it always had, its 5 kingdoms and their old, fragile treaties, its ferox migrations still sweeping the land in seasons no one could fully predict. But it turned now with one less secret buried beneath it, one less silence pretending to be peace, and Alara found, walking that last stretch of road home beside the man she loved, that she no longer needed to imagine another kind of life. She was already living in it.